The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
I'd like to say that tonight is an interesting evening because quite a lot of us here are gathered this evening on All Hallows Eve to hear a talk on neocolonialism. I'm very well aware of what happened to Martin Luther following this day in 1517, and equally cognizant of the reception of the Emeritus Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology, Nigel Biggar, right? As he was in 2023 published the book on colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, where his outraged colleagues in Oxford issued an open letter decrying Biggar's prescriptive, not prescriptions that not only did his prescription rest on a very bad history. One of the comments that they said of him was that it was breathtakingly politically naive. So I can only hope that I will not be excommunicated like Luther or cancelled like Biggar following this lecture. I think the truth of the matter is that we live in increasingly fractured world where we are constantly inundated with news of natural catastrophes, economic upheavals, geopolitical contestations resulting in wars and rumors of wars. I think you should be able to sort of identify all these fault lines, at least in our society. I was given a couple of months at beginning of, end of last year actually by Roland to consider the topic of this final ETHOS lecture. And I think the events happening around the world this year has indeed verified for me that we live in an increasingly fractured and fragmented world where we are daily inundated with news of all these natural catastrophes and all that. But I think more so at the beginning of this year, you actually have all this whole series of things that happened, right? Such as the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, the bid to reclaim the Panama Canal, proposed acquisition of Greenland, plans to make Canada the 51st state, global tariffs across the world on what is known as Liberation Day, all right? And then the pivot to the east to counter China, right? So the President of the United States of America's activities this, I guess you could say, past few months, right, are clear overtures to me that strike a rather dissonant chord, not unlike that of the imperial theme in Star Wars movies, which is sort of constantly referred to as the Darth Vader's theme, right? So together with the continuing wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, the escalating military strikes in Venezuela, even as is happening right now, the trade tensions with China, all of which has led to this discomforting inquiry of the rise of a new hegemon. Maybe scholars are thinking, is this the rise of a new imperial hegemon? A power that is, I think, within the context of, you realize it would affect Christianity in many, many ways. And this, I think, reflects also the reality of the rise of what we already know as the Global South. Okay, so this is the outline of my lecture for this evening. I was told it's going to be 50 minutes, but we might be here until maybe 10:30. I'm kidding. I will try. I looked at what the amount of time I have and the number of slides I have. It does not match. I have way too many slides, so I'm going to try to speak really fast. All right. So the introduction, history of colonialism, what is neocolonialism, and then I will make 3-part observations. One on the geopolitical, which I will. It's necessarily a little bit long, though. I think I'm not the expert in this area. In this way, I will call on the expertise of other scholars on this. I will take a look briefly at the social impacts and then on the missiological impacts. Right? So those are the 3 takeaways I hope that we can sort of bear in mind. Students of colonialism would probably know who this person is. I do not know if you're aware of who he is. His name is Jomo Kenyatta, all right, one of the former president in one of the African countries. He says, and this is a quote that has been attributed to him quite often, that when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible, we had the land, and they said, let us pray. And then we close our eyes. When we open them, we had the Bible and they had our land. I think that in many practical terms describe Africa's experience of colonialism, all right? And so even with biggest book, I think there has been a lot of upset over his glossing over some of these issues. You probably would know of this picture as well. So I think Bigger was actually trying to defend Cecil Rhodes when he wrote his book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Right, and this is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes apparently has been quoted to make this statement: I contend that we, the British, are the finest race in this world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Right, so if you notice where he stands on Africa. He stands really from Cairo to the Cape, which is, if you take a look, we'll take a look at one of the maps. It really is all of British territory from the north to the south of Africa. So he has been charged with being a white supremacist, but I think Bigger's one of his first chapter was to actually make a defense for Cecil Rhodes, which actually enraged quite a number of scholars in this area. Okay, so one of the other important points about colonialism is this poem, The White Man's Burden. You probably would have heard of this. It's written by Rudyard Kipling. Kipling's original intention was to write this poem for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, but he decided against it, and then he replaced it with another poem called Recessional. He changed the text, and then he sent this poem to his good friend, the governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, at that point in time, to reflect this very important subject of American colonization of the Philippines, which was recently won over to America from Spain in the Spanish-American War. That in many ways explains why America is also a main colonizer. It has colonized various parts of Asia as well. So The White Man's Burden, Kipling presented a rather Eurocentric view of the world where the whites have the burden to rule over the world and to encourage development and progress. And to such a time when the colonized then can take their place in the world today as they increasingly become like the colonizers. It may also be read as a phrase of condescension of sorts, or simply put, racist in justifying white colonialism. So it's been the subject of a lot of discussions. Literary scholars, historians have all tried to sort of understand what the white man's burden is, or what was the intention behind Kipling's writing of this. And so this is the poem itself. And I think in that sense, the poem has been caricaturized to this kind of diagram, that the white man's burden is to carry the Africans, the Asians, all the other skinned people, because they have a better society, a better culture, right? So it's rather controversial, but there are various interpretations of the white man's burden. So some may read this from a philanthropic perspective, that the rich indeed have a moral duty and obligation to help the poor, It was to help them better themselves, where the poor, whether the poor wants the help or not. So it's like, whether you need it or not, we are here to help you. And this is, at least in the mind of some scholars, it is in keeping with most of Kipling's own writings, which suggests that he genuinely held the position of a beneficent role. Western ideas and assistance may help in at least uplifting colonized societies. Furthermore, there were other commentators who point to Kipling's history of satirical writing and suggested that the white man's burden was in fact meant satirically to undermine really British imperialism. So it depends on how you read it. You might want to read further in that article there. Throughout history, I think kingdoms, empires have exerted force or control over weaker entities, and the term that's applied is really this term imperialism. You might be familiar, and I think a more kind of number of authors would sort of switch between colonialism and imperialism, and such that it has been used as though it is the same word. But historian Brian Stanley submits that the word imperialism really has undergone 12 distinct changes since its origins in the 1840s, and according to a major study by these two scholars. This is Brian Stanley. Interestingly, the term originated in the 1840s in France, where it denoted a desire to restore France to the glories of national greatness, which was France's to begin with under Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Right, so this term itself, imperialism, was applied to the kind of pomp and pageantry in the French Empire. So the initial term signified not so much a country's overseas possessions as it was initially used, but rather a style of domestic politics, which is characterized by militarism, bombast, and scant respect for constitutional liberties. Right? So if you take those three words, you realize that that is replicated all over in the various different features of colonialism that we get in the 1900s as well as in our current time. So imperialism remained a term that's heavily negative, has bad vibes, at least until the 1880 general elections in Britain, where it took on a more civilizing sense, for which they emphasized civilizing mission. In an important study, The Bible and the Flag, Protestant Missions and British Imperialism in the 19th and 20th century, this is again Brian Stanley. He defined the essence of imperialism as this: that it is controlled by an alien national or racial group. Such control may primarily be political or primarily economic and need not apply formal territorial rule. It may also be contrary to the original intentions of the imperial power, they only indirectly related to those intentions. So if you notice, he has a very broad actually definition of imperialism. And it is this third form of imperialism that I think most of us in Singapore can sort of identify with. There was no colonization of the land in that sense, unlike in Australia or in America. Right? So it was a sort of an informal rule of sorts. And so he sort of identifies three forms of imperialism. So that's where he breaks down the word. And then there are three forms of imperialism. The first, imperialism in the form of colonization, as with the growth of the British Empire in North America, as well as the colonization of Australia. So it's bringing the people over there and then taking over the land, having their own people build up that place. So it's colonization, all right? The second form of imperialism is to do with what is now known as colonialism, which where legal sovereignty has been ceded to or usurped by the imperial power without the large-scale human settlement. Right? That, I think, is something that we see. And then thirdly, informal imperial control, in which the imperial power wields predominant influence in a territory without resort or to either human settlement or formal political rule. So informal imperial control is probably what we see in this part of the world in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia and Singapore. All right. And part of my research, at least in my doctoral work, was to deal with British colonialism in Singapore. So Brian Stanley was the person that I had to read quite a lot in. And I think that's where he defines imperialism in this way. And given Singapore's experience, I think we do have a more positive experience in terms of colonialism. At the age of discovery, so this is where maybe we talk a little bit about colonialism. I probably should just skip this very quickly, but the European empires were really the very important empires that dealt with colonialism itself. So we could say that there were two waves, though some historians outlined that there were three waves. Right, two waves is kind of easy because the first wave was between 1492 to 1825. 1825 sort of ended that first wave because of the French Revolution and other wars of independence in South America. It was also the period of time of the abolition of slave trade. And so the second wave would be from this period all the way to the mid-1900s, which ended as a result of the end of World War II. For which then you have the rise of all these different nation states, especially in the parts of Asia and Africa. National independence sort of then led to the end of that second wave of colonial empire. So this would give you a map of the extent of European colonial power. Everything in green or light green has been influenced at least by European colonialism. Right, so you will notice it's all Europe in purple, and all the rest are green, except for those few other in sort of yellowish green. Okay, so which is why maybe growing up in Singapore, we used to sing, at least in our history class, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the world." Right, if those of you should be familiar with this. So you have, besides, so the different countries, it starts with Portugal. Portugal had a trader colonialism, and so it was informal. So if you realize, and maybe I should show Portugal and Spain together, you notice that Spain moves to the west, Portugal moves to the east. In various ways, it explains why most of the places in the east have very deep Portuguese influence. You just need to think of food. All right, whether it's devil curries, Portuguese egg tart, or whatever, it's that kind of influence. Even your tonkatsu, it's Portuguese. Yeah, your tempura is Portuguese as well, by the way, if you didn't already know. And when the Portuguese actually went towards Brazil, so Brazil apparently came under Portuguese rule. It's the only South American country that speaks Portuguese, right? Because the Pope drew a line that cut through Brazil, and anything that's east of that line would be Portuguese Empire. Anything west of that line would be Spanish Empire. That would be the Treaty of Tordesillas. All right, so this gives you a way in which these two shipping nations basically broke up the whole world into two halves. Except that they didn't realize that if you travel far east enough or far west enough, they're going to meet somewhere, and they're going to meet in the east. All right, and that's why they met in Spain and Indonesia, and that's where the Pope had to draw another line there, the Treaty of Saragossa, which then defined which country has which realm. All right. The next would be the Netherlands. Again, trader colonialism. And Netherlands, I think, came over partly because the interest was in trade in spices, especially. Right? The Netherlands or the Dutch would actually go as far as East Indies. They would have an impact in Taiwan, albeit briefly. And part of Japanese history, if you have been to Nagasaki, there's this deep sea, there's this port called Dejima, which was built because the Portuguese were the only ones allowed to trade with Japan after Japan's closure and the persecution of Christians, right? And then finally, you have, not finally, but the most important of the European powers would be Britain. Colonization, colonialism, and informal control. All three are found at least in British colonialism, or British imperialism, I should say. Right? America, Australia, Canada, Caribbean, Africa, from Cape to Cairo, India, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands. All right, and the big instrument there was obviously the East Indies Company, the East India Company. There was clear distinction between the merchants and missions, meaning that the British East India Company was only interested in ka-ching, ka-ching. Right? It's gold and glory, but not in that order. Okay. And they were interested only in making money. Okay, and they were, so aboard their ships, no missionaries would actually sail on board their ships. The only Christians or the only pastors or reverends that would travel on the ship was for chaplaincy work, wherever they had their ports of call. Okay, so this was the British extent of the British colonial empire. The last of the European would be the French. The French would be, again, the same, 3 ways of imperialism, where the French then developed this concept of civilizing mission, right? And Catholic missions came along with the French, and that, I think, in many ways, it also explains the Roman Catholic Church growth, at least in this part of Southeast Asia, especially in Singapore too, where the MEP, which is an order of the French Church, the Roman Catholic Church, would have a very significant influence in this part of the world, right? So within 12 years, from 1880 to 1900, one of the examples of this kind of colonialism we see, especially in Africa, every corner of the earth, from the highest mountains in the Himalayas to most of the remote Pacific islands, came to be claimed by one or another European power. All right, and this is where they sort of came together in a meeting and decided that they should carve up the whole of Africa for themselves as well. Right, so it's known as the scramble for Africa, or the rape of Africa. Africa was the most saw the most dramatic of colonization, because it was divided up as if it had been like a cake, sort of split up between the greedy European leaders, right? And this was called the scramble for Africa. Okay, so the key political event for the race was the Berlin Conference in 1884. Ignoring the rights of the existing African kingdoms and the peoples, the European powers then claimed the right to acquire inland territories by expansion from existing coastal possessions. So as long as they were there by the coast, all the other inlands were theirs, and then they sort of had a powwow between themselves to sort of say that this is my part, this is your part, and that's how Africa was carved up for all the European nations. Okay, in 1870, about 10% of Africa had been colonized, whereas by 1895, in a short 25 years, approximately 90% had come under European colonial control. Right, that is at least an example in Africa. The other example that was before this scramble for Africa is that of China. So there was similarly a scramble for China. Between 1600 to 1800s, the Qing emperors basically limited Western trade and contact to 2 ports, right? And it's basically Macau as well as Guangzhou. A large percentage of key trade, particularly Britain, was in opium, which was prohibited by the Chinese. In my research, you realize that the British wanted all things Chinese, whether it was porcelain, whether it was silk, whether especially tea. But the English had nothing that the Chinese wanted, right? Because they came with cotton, and then the Chinese, we wear silk, why would we want cotton from you? So it didn't make sense, right? And so the Chinese wanted then to use British silver. And Britain had to come up with another commodity, so they tried spices. Spices worked quite well, but the Dutch had some kind of monopoly there. And then they discovered that, hey, they could actually use opium. And opium was grown in vast quantities in Africa, in India, for which then they had taken tea from China and planted tea in India so that they could continue their trade and bring back tea to Britain and to Europe, which is why you have those fine Darjeeling tea. All of that was from China. So there is a little diagram, I think, on social media that if the tea goes by land, right, it is called cha. If it goes by sea, it's known as tea, all right? Basically that, and so you have drawings and caricatures of this, the British imperial powers. From 1830s to 1850, the Chinese fought and lost the 2 opium wars, and they were made to pay reparations and to cede treaty ports to China, to the Western forces, especially to the British. European powers and Japan then carved up China into spheres of influence and treaty ports. China ceded Hong Kong to the British, allowed foreign missionaries access into China, That, I think, in many ways explain why in the 1840s, a lot of these missionaries were in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore. And when China opened, all of them just abandoned Singapore and they moved over to China, with the exception of Benjamin Keysbury. All right, so that sort of gives us some kind of a clarity as to what happened here because China was now open due to the unequal treaties. And this would be another cartoon caricature of what happened with China. And China here is really like a pie that's actually being divided because of the weak Manchurian powers. So the period decline and defeat of the Qing dynasty resulting in foreign intervention, annexation, and subjugation of China by Western powers, Russia and Japan, from 1839 to 1949 is often referred to as the century of humiliation, right? 百年国秀. 国耻, sorry, yeah. So we need to know that this is a very important part of Chinese history, for which the Chinese look back and say, never again. Right? They were referred to as yellow peril. They were called all kinds of things. And I think that's where it gives us the context of some of that movements, at least in what is happening in the current trade conflict. Okay. So with decolonization, after the two world wars, what happened was that there was what we refer to as the undoing of colonization. The end of World War II signified the process of decolonization. And that moment in the middle of the 20th century in which a number of countries had been colonized for roughly a century and when about half of them emerged as independent nations. So that from 1945 onwards, we have this new period which is referred to as decolonization. From 1945 to 1965, about 75 countries gained independence, of which Singapore is one of them. Right, from the European colonial powers, depending on the nature of their former ties, most were peaceful processes. But there were obviously some bad experience too. For some others, however, independence came as a result of protracted periods of wars of liberation. If you recall, Vietnam and Algeria, they had to fight very, very painful wars against the French. All right, and as a result, gained independence, but got caught into bigger troubles that sort of resulted in the Vietnam War. As decolonization was happening, I think colonialism now was taking on a new permutation, leading critics of colonization to decry neocolonization or neocolonialism as the last stage of colonialism. So it's sort of, as countries were gaining independence, decolonization was happening, colonization took on a new form altogether of neocolonialism. This is written by Nkrumah, right? He calls it, neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. He wrote there, and I quote, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political polity is directly from outside. Neocolonialism is also the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility. For those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress." Right, so it was this new form of subjugation and control from, not in terms of pure military power, but in using all different kinds of ways to sort of control the countries. So the definition of neocolonialism is this: it refers to the control of less developed countries by developed countries through indirect means, such as the use of economic, political, cultural, religious, and other pressures. Right, so if you think about it, colonialism now sort of in some ways stops short of using military might, using gunboat diplomacy of sorts, but it sort of uses different kinds of pressure to be exerted on the less developed countries. This is an important book written by the Komaroffs, Jean and John Komaroff. While the term obviously references political control, input from Jean and John Komaroff's work on colonialism is really helpful, where they describe the phases of colonialism as a dialectical process. that of the colonization of consciousness and the consciousness of colonization. Right? Colonization of consciousness is that you get colonized, you get to think that it's a bit like George Orwell's Animal Farm, 4 legs good, yeah, two legs bad, and then you sort of keep reciting that, and then it says 4 legs good, 2 legs better. Okay, so neocolonialism intrinsically has political, social, and missiological implications. You notice that I've just started on what I need to say about colonialism. All right. So just to sort of quickly move on, that's where you have now the Cold War period. The end of World War II then precipitated a period of global geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective capitalist and communist allies, which resulted in the formation of NATO as well as the Warsaw Pact. All right. Those of you who are into movies, and if you've not watched this movie, you should. This is Oppenheimer. All right. If you're not familiar with it, go Google it and watch this movie. The rivalry, I think, was alluded to in Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer in 2023, where as he witnessed the first atomic bomb, Oppenheimer referenced a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Right? He says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He saw the severity, the gravity of using the atomic bomb. And while he was trying to say that we should limit this, and I think in Oppenheimer, Einstein was a part of that process to talk about limitation of atomic power. This became a power struggle between America and the USSR. Right, and then there are all these conjectures. Could America not have dropped the 2 atomic bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Because most historians are of the view that Japan was at its weakest point at that point in time. Japan would have surrendered in September or October of 1945, even without the 2 bombings. The 2 bombings were in some way to show who has the upper hand in terms of atomic powers. And so it started this whole Cold War between these 2 blocks. And so you really do have this development of the Cold War, where this sort of shows you where the countries are, Europe versus Russia, right? I think this would be a diagram of showing all the so-called the causes of the Cold War. They are actually, so it's not merely only one in terms of atomic bomb, but there are all these other causes. You could probably get access of that if you take a picture, but I think I'll make my notes available to all of you. The timeline of this is here. So if you notice, the Cold War resulted in somewhere in the 1960s, where we almost will not be gathered here today if the Cuban Missile Crisis came to sort of a fatal end. That was when the war almost reached nuclear proportions, where just a misstep would have caused nuclear warfare between Russia and America. Right, so you could also get access to this on this website. So the rise of the 2 superpowers, USA and USSR, and their allies, created a world order that was indeed bipolar. 2 poles, right? They were constantly at each other's necks. As these 2 blocs embarked on a policy to pull the rest of the world into their own orbits, there was also a bid to counterbalance this bipolarity of the world order, resulting in the formation of the non-aligned movement. So there were countries that says that we don't want to be caught in this fight. It's maybe like what ASEAN is, right? For which I think in recent days you've noticed how ASEAN have played up this thing with Trump to make him dance, give him gifts and all that, all right? So they tried to say, we are not going to choose between the 2 power blocks, whether it's the communists or the capitalists. So at the Bandung Conference in 1955, the 10 principles were foundations of the so-called the non-aligned movement were articulated. And so the non-aligned movement was formed in that period of time. And so these are the countries in the non-aligned movement. And we notice, I think here we have the births of what we refer to as multipolarity. So it's not only those 2 blocks, but it's also these other countries that says don't make us choose. We're going to be not aligned to any of these two. All right. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the USSR in December, the US then emerged from this period as the sole superpower, economic, financial, and military, as well as the sole hegemon. Right? So the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991 is a very, very significant date, right? Because besides economic and military power, the power of such American values and ideology make the US become a multi-dimensional hegemony, a global hegemon with sufficient hard power and soft power to shape international politics. So since 1991, if you realize, that's really the extent of American power. So you can actually read more of that in this article here as well. All right. How do we explain America's power? I think this is where I do not know if any one of you have come across the Wolfowitz doctrine. It's got nothing to do with theology at all. The Wolfowitz doctrine is a policy document drafted by Paul Wolfowitz, the then Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in 1992, asserted the nation's right to take unilateral action and maintain global hegemony. Right? So apparently when this was drafted, it was leaked to New York Times. Right? The proposed policy of unilateralism and preemptive military engagement to ensure that no other country could rise to challenge the supremacy of the United States. That was the essence of the Wolfowitz doctrine. The draft was leaked to New York Times and it sparked controversy. Nonetheless, the elements of the Wolfowitz doctrine continues to influence US foreign policy. So this unilateral strikes to maintain its primacy in the world is basically what the Wolfowitz doctrine was trying to outline here. Right? So you can actually get a copy of the declassified data in the Wolfowitz doctrine. Right? So this is where, as a result of this, since 1991, you have this development of all the military bases. United States apparently is the only country that has 750 military bases all across the world. All right, all across the world. So you take a look at the amount it was deployed. There are now 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. That's the extent of military power here. Okay, so this is the so-called countries who have the most number of US bases. Notice where they are is in Japan as well as South Korea. All right, countries with the most number of US troops. Then you might say, so why are you using Al Jazeera's data? How can it be true? Right? Please don't downplay Al Jazeera, because if you're talking about US policy, you should read Al Jazeera. Right? If you're talking about Singapore, you shouldn't read Straits Times. All right, you should read some other newspapers. I think that's kind of a helpful way of looking at things. Because if you don't believe Al Jazeera, then I would show you an American site. All right, this is written by the Brethrens. All right, the Brethrens, in looking at this, says that this is the extent of military power as well, and this is the kind of spending that America has. Take a look at the amount of spending. All right, China isn't even half of it. All right, so who is the one that's all hell bent on war? All right, so I think that should give us some kind of clarity here, okay? So in the post-Cold War period, and this is one person that I really do like to refer to. If you do have time, go look at Pascal Lotte's website. When he is the researcher in the neutrality studies, he noted this. When we talk about Cold War and then you talk about post-Cold War, so some politicians, some thinkers are saying now we're in the post-Cold War, but he is saying that needs to be redefined. He says, I've always been uncomfortable with the designation of the period after the collapse of Soviet Union as post-Cold War. It strikes me as a very temporary expression to refer to the current world, since anything that is post must necessarily be ante. Something else. What is post is prior to something else, right? So what is this prior to? So this is Lotte's. Is that Substack blog that he writes. He says, from the bipolarity of Cold War to the unipolarity of the post-Cold War and now the new multipolarity of the current era. Hence, we also have the new name for this last 30 years from 1991 to 2021 to 2022. If you notice, that was when you have the start of the Ukraine war. He calls this 30-year period the unipolar moment, right? The unipolar moment where there is one big hegemonic power, United States. All right. So in a lecture given at Cambridge Executive Leadership, a Surviving World Order to Come, retired US diplomat Chas Freeman also noted this. He says, a new world order is coming into being. Many call it multipolar, but it is better described as multinodal. All right, nodes, all right, 节点 are places where many connections of diverse sizes and intensities originate, terminate, and intersect at different vectors. Multinodal is a more accurate depiction of the geopolitical geometry that is now emerging, right? So I tried to show you it's multinodal here, okay? You might want to refer to this article here, which he wrote. Freeman acknowledges that there are currently two superpowers, but at the same time, there are also regional powers that are flourishing in this current environment. And these include Russia, India, Japan, countries in BRICS, as well as the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? That I think it's beginning to show that, hey, American hegemony is not going to rule the world. So he says this in his final analysis, that we need to craft a peace based on mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, tolerance and equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. If we cannot do this, we risk more than our prosperity. We risk our very existence. Right? So we are teetering to a very, very tough place, at least in this point of history here. All right. So with that in mind, that's the geopolitical side. All right, which I would say that's really not my area, but I've been actually reading up, trying to find out more information. I want to say something about the social aspect, the colonization of consciousness. I thought of maybe giving you some gifts, and maybe if you get all 16 of this correct, okay? Let's try this out, okay? Let's see if you can identify all of these icons. You should know this, right? Okay, just for you, those of you who do not know, you should at least, all right? Okay, so please don't think that it's only the Americans that are trying to colonize your consciousness, because the Chinese are also trying to do so. So I'm going to give you another 8 from China. Okay. There's no TikTok. You know the one in the middle? No, the one on the top line. Yeah, that's China's most luxurious car, right? Hongqi, all right? I'm sure you use Taobao, all right? And Didi as well, and Huawei, all right? So if you don't already know, there is this whole competition out there to try to grab understanding of who rules the world, at least from the level of economics and social order, right? So aspects of consumeristic, whether it's US or Chinese influence in our daily lives, you realize that there's lots of misinformation and disinformation, right? It results in fake news. And what you could do is to keep repeating this. If you keep repeating it, you'll keep getting, there's this echo chamber that you get into, right? You keep saying the same thing. You can believe that you can do it. And then this is what happens. And then the amplification, social media algorithms and echo chambers, right? You notice, I mean, I just checked something about animal life in Singapore, and the next thing, my Facebook has all this local sightings of animals, and then my YouTube has what the snakes found in Singapore. It's like, what is this happening? So much as you think that Huawei is spying on you, I think Google is also spying on us. All right. So as in Orwell's Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs better. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal. You notice that that kind of propaganda is how propaganda works. It keeps coming back to us. It keeps telling us the same thing. Right? And if you keep hearing things that, oh, America is good, and China is bad, or the other way, China is good, America is bad, you probably will get to hear the same things all over again. Which is why one of the things, like I said earlier on, if you want to read anything about US policy, read Al Jazeera. All right, if you want to read anything about China, you might want to look at the Chinese side, but also read something else, because all we know about China is whatever is from CNN or New York Times. Right, which is one way of them looking at China itself. Right, so we need to have that kind of balance here. Okay, so say it enough times, repeat it, amplify it. That is how we get so-called misinformation and disinformation. Think about this. How is it that USA gets to pass a 1.6 billion, right, bill to deliver anti-Chinese propaganda overseas? This was passed only this year. But nobody says anything about it. They have a 1.6 billion amount to have anti-China propaganda, you know? And think about this as well. How is it that one side always references the other side as adversary and enemy? All right, you notice if you try to read a Chinese perspective, China has never referred to America as adversary or enemy. Take that as an example. Next 2 days, go and check your news feed and see what happens. All right, that I think is the way in which our consciousness gets colonized. And then we begin to think exactly like, what are these so-called colonial powers that want to have control over us? So I'd like to just give you 2 or 3 examples. Russia's war with Ukraine is an unprovoked war. All right, China's growing assertiveness or aggression in the South China Sea. And I would include the third, but it's for sensitivity issue. I'm not going to say anything else about this, and refer you to some other things just in case some people might get a little bit heated up here. Israel's war with Gaza started on 7 October 2023, right? Take for example, Russia's war with Ukraine is an unprovoked war. You read that many, many times. Is it really unprovoked? All right, so this is what Jeffrey Sachs has to say. Jeffrey Sachs says there were in fact 2 main US provocations. The first was the US intention to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia in order to surround Russia in the Black Sea region by NATO countries, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, in counterclockwise order. All right. The second was US role in installing a Russophobic regime in Ukraine by the violent overthrow of Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014. The shooting war in Ukraine began with Yanukovych's overthrow 9 years ago, not in February 2022, as the US government, NATO, and G7 leaders would have us believe. Go take a look at the article that he has actually written many, many times. In fact, he wants to let people know, but New York Times have actually banned publishing his articles. That's how silencing and propaganda works. All right, so this is basically a picture of NATO expansion. All right. If you notice, all the light blue are actually in recent times. NATO countries actually ended with Germany, right? All that was in 1955. 1999 is where Germany gets included into NATO, all right? And so Sachs makes this point that there was this understanding that NATO will not move 1 inch eastwards, right? And that is, I think, the center of controversy here. Unprovoked war, NATO expansion. This is where you should take a look at this And this is in the archives. And my other job, I think, in the Methodist Church is the person in charge of the Council of Archives. All right. And so looking at archival records is something that sort of excites me quite a lot. So if you look at this archival record, which was released, US Secretary of State James Baker's famous not 1 inch eastwards assurance about NATO's expansion in his meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev on February 9, 1990 was part of the cascade of assurances about Soviet security given by Western leaders to Gorbachev and other Soviet officials throughout the process of German unification in 1990 and into 1991. This is NATO's expansion, what Gorbachev heard. Notice that not 1 inch has now resulted in another, how many? 14 countries, the latest of which is Finland, that is right at the border of Russia. And so Russia is basically making the point that my security is being threatened by you trying to surround me with all these places that you can actually bomb me closer to, right? I'm not saying that Russia is justified to go into Ukraine and do war there, all right? But just as what America says about national security, shouldn't Russia also be understood as part of that national security process for that country too, which is what I think Sachs is trying to highlight. So he's of the opinion that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war and it did not start on the 24th of February 2020. It started with a coup in 2014. Right? And the coup was started by CIA agents in Ukraine itself. It's well documented. If you don't believe me, these are the places you should go and take a look, because it's not only by Jeffrey Sachs when he talks about the geopolitics of peace. This was a very long speech that he gave to the parliament February of this year to tell them that they need to stop this war and they need to actually dialogue with Putin. Since 2022, February, they have not talked at all to Putin. If you want to have a peace deal, shouldn't you talk to the aggressor? Right, so the dialogue hasn't been there at all. So he makes a case to the European Parliament that they need to do a process of dialogue. So not only him, but Jan Orberg actually highlights this, that Russia is not a threat to NATO or neutral states, full stop. Right, you might want to read in that article that Jan Orberg actually wrote. All right, with regards to China's growing assertiveness and aggression, I don't really have the time to actually go into this, except that I could point you to all these very important scholars in this area. And these are the people that you should take a look at, right? You have Kishore Mahbubani, you have Wang Kangwu, who is the sinologist. All right, go take a look at his video. These are all videos here. So you might think that Kishore is probably a China dove, right? There's this China dove and China hawk, or American dove and American hawk, so depending on where they are. But these are three. If obviously, I think Wang Kangwu is going to be a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more balanced. I would say Kishore's point of view is really very good too. The other person that you should also take a look at is this, George Yeo. George Yeo gave a very important lecture in the May of 2023, China in Europe's future and Europe in China's future, where he outlines it for us. Right, he had a debate and then in the selected musings in the Cambridge Union, he actually talked about this. As to the third example of Gaza, I refer you to such as Jeffrey Sachs, Pascal from Neutrality Studies, as well as authors such as Munter Isaac, if you're interested in looking at the situation between Gaza and Israel. Right, the book by Munter Isaac is a very important book. Google his name, get a copy of his book and read at least a history of Palestinian Christians that has also been persecuted by the Israelis. Okay, so moving on, that's part of that kind of social complex that we get actually false information. Okay, this is where, when we deal with this aspect of church history and missiological context, the history of Christian missions was primarily recorded and propagated with Europe and North America as the centers of Christianity. That I think we all are very familiar with. Prior to the turn of the 21st century, most, if not all, of the textbooks of the history of Christianity were predominantly Eurocentric and unidirectional, from the West to the rest. right? Propagation of Christianity pulsated from both Rome and Constantinople, the centers of western and eastern parts of the Roman Empire. So much so that if you sort of follow the reading of church history in the 1990s, these would be the books that you actually follow, you read, right? Some of, I think if you, in the 1980s, it would be Philip Schaff's book, History of Christian Church, which is a 7-volume work, right? Mostly about Christianity that went up to Europe and from Europe all across the world. Bruce Shelley's book is actually easier to read. It's 1 volume, but no pictures. Right, in plain English, in plain language, so a little bit challenging if you would like to have some pictures. But Literate has 2 books, volume 1 and volume 2. Again, it tends to be a little bit more Eurocentric, right? And I think various historians and scholars have observed and written about the shift of the gravity. So when we talk about the gravity of Christianity, it's shifted north to south, right? So at least if you know this, that the center has now shifted, right? The center is no longer in Europe or America. It's actually shifted southwards because now the places of growth is in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. And so scholars or historians who have written about this would be people like Andrew Walls, Edward Norman, Lamin Sane, Philip Jenkins, Mark Knoll, Scott Sundquist, Hua Yung, Todd Johnson, and many other so-called scholars, historians as well. So the shrinking of the global north and the shifting to the global south is the essence of world Christianity's characteristics at the start of the 21st century. Right, so I think that's again well documented that Christian population in America and Europe has been shrinking through the years, right? Whereas population in the South is growing. So Jenkins' statement, the emerging Christian world will be anchored in the southern continents, right? That I think is the reality that we see in these 2 diagrams I'm going to show you. If you take a look at what happened in, let's say, 1910, all right? All of the majority of Christianity is in Europe as well as North America, right? By 2010, if you notice, they're no longer the majority, right? But in those 3 places, Latin America, Africa, as well as Asia, right? So this, I think, in some ways, numerically shows us this shift southwards. But you can actually get that diagram from Gordon Conwell's website. This other is found in the Lausanne Conference website. If you notice, that's the growth of, in terms of numbers of Christians in the global south, right? Latin America is 612, Africa is 667, which is actually the biggest right now. And Asia is 379, though I think that it's undercounted in many ways, right? Partly because of the persecution of Christians in Asia itself. Right, you might want to take a look at the article there. So this book, The Next Christendom, sort of chronicles. This was written in 2001. I remember having to read that when I was doing my studies at Asbury. It's like, whoa, this is contrary to what I was told in church history, right? But he was already recording this. He writes this in First Things. We can only speculate what this future synthesis might look like, but underlying all these possibilities is one solid reality. However partisan the interpretations of the new Christianity, however paternalistic, there can be no doubt that the emerging Christian world will be anchored in the southern continents. When we look at today's new faces of Christianity, we are seeing the shape of the Christian future. Right? The fact of the matter is that Christianity is looking more Asian, Christianity is looking more African, Christianity is looking more Latin American. Right? So much so that if you take a look at the World Missionary Conference in 1910, the high point of church history and mission history at this point in time, 1910 was when the world gathered for the very first Protestant Missionary Conference. It was referred to as, in Literate, as the Great Century of Missions from 1800 to 1910, what I think church historians would refer to the century of Christian missions. And 1910 was that World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh itself, and one of the main focus was encapsulated in the question, what will it take to finish the job in the unoccupied fields, right? So those gathered were predominantly, interestingly, white Protestants. Brian Stanley noted that of the 1,215 official delegates, 509 were British, 491 were North American, 169, so on and so forth. Notice only 19 were from the non-Western world. 19, all right? From the non-Western world, what we refer to as the majority world today. 18 of them were from Asia and 1 unnamed from Africa. All right? And so you can, I mean, if you could teleport back in time, you notice it's going to be a very, very white men gathering. All right, so this was the 1910 Edinburgh Conference. Compare 1910 to what happened last year at Seoul in the Lausanne 4 Conference. Right, let me just give you the statistics there. This is the Lausanne Conference held last year in September. All right. Notice that now North America is only 25.5%. And then you have at least 3% from Oceania. You have actually 10 from Southeast Asia, 9.6 from South Asia, right? And this is where scholars would say that this better reflects the multipolarity of Christianity, that now even Christianity itself has representations from all across the world. It's not only the Western centers. So no longer missions from west to the rest, but missions from everyone to everywhere. Right? That sort of reflects the reality that I think mission studies historians are talking about. With regards to multipolarity or the global south or majority world, more recently there have been gatherings of Christian leaders from the majority world. The term majority world is preferred to over third world or global south. One of the reasons why they prefer the majority world because the term majority world echoes a paradigm shift in Christianity that has happened over the past century. In the past, missionary sending was largely mono-directional. This means these countries in the majority world received missionaries from the West and were not sending missionaries to other countries in the past 100 years. We have seen a shift from mono-directional mission sending to polycentric mission sending, showcasing the important contributions of the majority world in global missions, which is why at least this person, Dennis Henry, says that the better term to use would be the majority world because it shows how Christianity is spreading from everywhere to everywhere. It's not uni or one or two directional or in the case of reverse mission. Right? This is where you have the Majority World Christian Leaders Conference. The primary concern of these leaders in the Majority World Christian Leaders Conference is this. All right, and these are the people that they have started meeting as early as the early 2003 onward, and they have actually continued to meet. He says that churches in the majority world should no longer operate as mere transplanted versions of Western Christianity. Coming from different parts of the world, we must bring our own distinctive histories, philosophical, religious worldviews, and cultures into engagement with and expression of the faith. That is one of their concerns, all right? And this is where I think it sort of ties quite nicely with Andrew Walls when he says this. In the cross-cultural process of Christian history, Walls noted, the signs suggest that what Christianity of the 21st century will be like in its theology, its worship, its effect on society, its penetration of new areas, whether geographically or culturally, will depend on what happens in Africa, Latin America, and in some parts of Asia. Take that to heart because it means what is happening here right now is helping shape the future of Christianity as well. All right? So in many of his volumes in his book, Missionary Movements in Christian History, Walls wrote, third world theology is more likely to be representative Christian theology. Right? Walls, again, is a person of his time. I think that's where the term third world theology sometimes has a somewhat negative connotation, whereas I think more mission theologians would prefer to use the term contextual theology. All right? And so much akin to Chas Freeman's multinodal analysis, each node is connected to other nodes. And similarly, in contextualization and studies in contextual theology, we need to be aware of relativism, of trying to operate from our individual or independent theological wells, thereby articulating an infinite number of local, independent, mutually exclusive theologies. That is one of the danger when you keep saying that all theology is contextual theology. Then everybody would have their own. In the end, who is the voice to listen to, right? So this is where theologians, at least among the majority world, are thinking through some of these issues. So Bosch reminds us that there are faith traditions which all Christians share and which should be respected and preserved. Right? He comments also that this does not only mean that third world Christians should continue, that this does not only mean that third world Christians should continue to study Western theology, but also that first world Christians should study third world theologies. This mutual overlap, this mutual nodal interactions would actually benefit the church at large. All right, so perhaps one of the most obvious ramifications is the issue of ordination of LGBTQ. Gene Robinson in 2003 is this case, and the blessing of same-sex marriage in both USA and UK. The ensuing debates on gender and sexuality have really caused clashes between the progressive and the conservative, predominantly from the majority world, and has fractured the unity within the various mainline denominations, notably the Anglican Communion as well as the United Methodist Church. United Methodist Church recently had their split as the last major denomination to break, partly because they kept postponing their general conference. Right? They didn't want to deal with the issue. And then in I think 2024, they decided to cannot push it down any further, because what held the communion together were the more conservative views of the Africans, the Asians, and the Latin Americans that were in America itself. All right, and they were not wanting to sort of split, but that split was somehow inevitable. All right, so not discounting doctrinal and other important factors, underlying these fractures is perhaps also the issue of neocolonialism and the tacit and perhaps unspoken conviction that the West knows better, or that the West is best. And in some ways, that could be read as theological imperialism. All right, because we think maybe Western categories are better. So what do these Africans or these Chinese or these Asians or Latin Americans have to tell us or teach us? That kind of imperialism, I think we need to be very, very careful of, right? So in terms of mission praxis, in recent years, the challenge in the majority world is that it is not only the global south of the majority world is not only the mission field, it is also the mission force. Right? You have heard it many, many times at many mission conference. You can hashtag from mission field to mission force. Right? That has become the kind of common lingo that's being used, at least in mission meetings all across Asia recently. I think this is certainly encouraging. All right, to me it is encouraging, but amidst the missionary zeal, I do raise the caution lest we become the agents of neocolonial missions ourselves, where like our former colonial masters, we operate under the guises of crusading, civilizing, and colonial missions. Right? We become the people that we critique, and that we become exactly like those people that we don't want to become. Some of our calls, structures, and practices and missions seem to me unabashedly paternalistic, prescriptive, as well as self-aggrandizing. Right? If you can make that connection, there is one article in Christianity Today that I caution against this kind of self-aggrandizing. All right? I probably shouldn't mention that too publicly. But one example I was raised for us, at least in the person of Roland Allen, the missionary to China from the Anglican Church. Roland Allen, I think, has been really very consistent in the way that he is fully aware of what colonial mission looks like. And so his principles to reverse long-term political hegemony is actually articulated in his work, right? Missionary Methods. The old title is in Paul's or ours, right? Where he talks about these three very important principles. I'll just say them. To teach the native converts to recognize their responsibilities as members of the church, never to do for the natives anything that they could do for themselves. Secondly, to avoid the introduction of any foreign element unless it is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the books, the vestments, the ornaments, the design of the building all come from a foreign land. The church is the foreigner's church. Thirdly, to be always retiring from the people to prepare the way for final retirement. To become indispensable to the people is really to fail. Rather, the missionary should patiently watch while the Holy Spirit transform strange forms of life into Christian forms of life unlike their own. Right? That's basically what Alan has to sort of tell us. In commending the genius of Roland Allen, Martin Goldsmith wrote in this article, you might want to go and Google that. We have come to see that our biblical exposition and theological expressions are determined by our cultural and philosophical context. While the word of God in Christ and in the scriptures is an unchanging absolute, our understanding of the word, our theology, and our communication of the gospel are all fallible. We must therefore encourage national churches to develop their own biblical and theological understanding rather than impose on them our views like Western theological imperialists. Right? And I think that's the kind of example you have, at least in this person, Roland Allen. There's something about people who are named Roland. Right? The increasing multiple loci of propagation of the Christian faith ensures that we will not again repeat the excesses of colonial missions or perceive mission as simply a project for sending out missionaries in the hope of changing the world and making disciples in our own image. Right? Bear that in mind, we should not be striving to make disciples in our own image, but rather in the image that God has created them. Instead of a mission that is unidirectional, mission is really multinodal and multidirectional. Instead of a mission that is paternalistic, mission is increasingly a partnership that engages everyone at the periphery. Right? While the old colonialism may arise in new permutations, Alan Yeh is emphatic that the future of mission is polycentric, or what we should say, multidirectional, and that the entire global church needs to work together to bring the gospel to the nations. All right? And so the building of this multipolar or multinodal or multi-ethnic missional community is the context that necessitated, at least where Andrew Walls was concerned, that precipitated the writing of the book of Ephesians. Because everybody was kind of trying to push for their own way, to say that their way is the best way. Right? So that was why Paul had to write the book of Ephesians, where he outlines what God's plan for the church really looks like. And so Andrew Walls sees this breaking down of walls of division and the building of the temple of God as what he refers to as the Ephesian moment. All right, so you might want to look at this article. This article is found in that book. You can actually Google it as well and you get the whole article itself. He noted that the very height of Christ's full stature is reached only by the coming together of the different cultural entities into the body of Christ. Only together, not on our own, can we reach this full stature. None of us can reach Christ's completeness on our own. We need each other's vision to correct, to enlarge, to focus our own. Only together are we complete in Christ. All right, and so I began with this, that we live in a context that is increasingly divisive and polemical. All right, all these issues we have to contend with. And we can't even come together to talk about climate change. It's probably the least important on the agenda here, right? But if you don't, think about your children. Think about your children's children. All right? Because you don't want them to inherit an environment that they have to be constantly in an aircon bubble all 24 hours of the day. All right? So in politics, in economics, in sociology, and various aspects of life, we are witnessing an increasingly fractured world where competing power brokers seek to exert their respective unipolar dominance. This rise of the church in the majority world, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multipolar, multinodal, brings to the forefront really the Ephesian question. Will the church in all its diversity demonstrate its unity by the interactive participation of all its culture-specific segments. What Andrew Walls highlights in his article, will the body of Christ be realized or fractured in this new Ephesian moment? So my question to us as I sort of tie this up is this: will you then respond to God's call, especially in the midst of these challenging times, to be his witness, to be his partners in his mission to everyone and to everywhere? Thank you for your support of the ETHOS Institute.